Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Carl Schmitt's Legality and Legitimacy. Today we're looking at chapter 4. Um, um, and we're going to come last two chapters, and then there's two other things. So we're almost basically done. The fourth chapter deals with the extraordinary lawgiver, right? The rationale suprematist. It means this, extraordinary, extraordinary reason, actual meaning. And then he says, what is the actual meaning of this rationale? So the plebiscitary legitimacy instead of the legitimate state legality. So therefore, he's going to be. Remember, we go back all the way to the beginning of his a book here, Legality and Legitimacy, where he sets forth in the introduction four states, where the legislative state was one of the types of states, which was the parliamentary state, which is understood in this terms of this bourgeois idea of separation of powers and things, and that the people itself would have the ultimate say. The people, through their democratic institutions, through their legislature, would have this, through their legislature. Okay, and that all power does this. Now, there's another thing. It replaces what it was called the governmental state, which was basically the monarchs. The monarchs of old, the kings ruled, and this was all power through that. And this kind of emerged out of and as an alternative to something the Middle Ages that called jurisdictional state of different jurisdictional entities that had authority over certain matters and other authority, and there was no one set of authority. The command, this is the history of this is kind of the development from feudal, early modern, and what we say post 48. He says this is Schmitt's idea, post 48, post French Revolution. This is the idea of popular sovereignty through legislative entities, right? The new idea comes in, and he says the last category was the administrative state, where the administrative entities, that the bureaucrats and this through statutes and statutory aspects do this, and this is a product of the total state. He argues now. So therefore, what does total state emerge out of this? And he says that he's giving. Now, again, this is the problem with Schmitt. Schmitt is not this Schmitt text doesn't really deal with kind of an abstract thing or a general thing. He's dealing specifically with the situation of Germany in at the time he's writing, 1933, 32, 33, and the crisis of the parliamentary system that is occurring at this time. Okay, and why did it occur this way? And why it was due to the failure of the Constitution. Okay, and this is what he's going to get into in these book chapters he's been dealing with. So he needs to deal with this question of the extraordinary lawgiver. He's saying the lawgivers are doing, his threefold criteria of lawgiving. The second one is this extraordinary lawgiver, right? He dealt with this chapter in chapter 4, 3, 2, and 3, right? This is the structure of how he's going to go about his analysis of why the lawgiver, who is the lawgiver. The lawgiver is essential in the parliamentary model because it is the basis by who has the authority. The legislative power is the one that has the parliamentary legislative power is the supreme power. And this becomes challenged in the problem of the exception, right? The exceptional. This is why he terms this idea of the exceptional lawgiver. The lawgiver at the time of the exception. Exception is the tension between the norm and the exception. The norm is how things are working, everything's working normal, and the exception is when the normals aren't particularly when the safety and security of the public body, the state, is at risk, right? So let's go turn to this question, right? This is he's talking about this move from the shift from plebiscitary legitimacy instead of the legitimacy of the legislative state legality. Okay, right? The first occasion in the Weimar Constitution for calling into question the parliamentary legislative state lies in the introduction of substantive constitutional guarantees. So this is the argument that all of a sudden you have in the Weimar Constitution two parts. Part one deals with the thing, and part two then all of a sudden deals with these guarantees, right? That are going to be substantive constitutional guarantees, right? Through these provisions, substantive principles of in the form of values that are set and secured and countered the value neutrality and the openness of the legislative state system of legality. And the legislature is split into an extraordinary higher lawmaker and a simple lower one. So, in other words, he's saying that basically what he's saying here is this conception that all of a sudden you have this. The first part of the Weimar Constitution, process and procedure, is kind of like well, everything, and what is valued will simply be the people's will, the majority will at any moment in time, and this is value neutral in that sense, right? This is very positivistic. But then all of a sudden you have the second level, the second part, which all of a sudden deals with certain fundamental, substantive constitutional guarantees, protections of certain rights, and that therefore creates two lawgivers: the ordinary lawgiver and what he says here, this super what do you call openness to the extraordinary higher lawmaker. Now, this higher, and he dealt with this before in the other chapters. The problem of this distinction in this that ordinary thing only requires 50%, but to alter the constitutional sacred provisions of the second thing needs of this higher percent, right? This 60, above 60%, 60s, about 2/3, right? This idea of 2/3, like you had to have the super majority to do this, and he's kind of mocked and showed the problems of such that argument in the previous chapters. But it sets up this concept of two legislators, an ordinary one and this higher lawmaker, right? This one, okay? The resulting rupture of the parliamentary legislative state, elements of jurisdiction, a jurisdictional state in truth. So therefore, by creating these things, right? By creating this twofold situation, Schmitt is arguing that now you've entered into a jurisdiction. It's no longer a simple parliamentarian state, legislative state, right? In a simple parliamentary model, right? It is not no longer a simple legislative state. Now there's two things, and there's now different jurisdictions. That the ordinary thing is under this jurisdiction, and these constitutional provisions are in this higher jurisdiction, right? So there's this jurisdictional, and that's again dividing and making the state divided in that sense. Principality through judicial examination of the substantive legality of ordinary statutes. So, in other words, the judges examining the substantive legality, or through though in other ways as well. These jurisdictional state elements are constantly at work to ensure that the fissure perpetually widens and deepens. So therefore, what's going to happen is this original thing, that the courts and other bodies will constantly make this go wide, this fissure between these two things get wider and wider. Maybe I'm limiting myself to the screen. Maybe I got to get a better screen. So let me see if I can just, Now I have to get this. Eek! Okay, we'll see what this does. So, what is going on here in this sense? It's giving us a warning. He's saying that all of a sudden judicial decisions are going to start widening this gap between these two things, right? Thus introducing an extraordinary lawgiver at the same time, means a change of the original conceived state type, which determined by the dominant position of the legislature. So all of a sudden you have this other problem, the problem of the extreme situation, right? The extraordinary situation, not the ordinary time. So therefore you have two things. You have this one process dealing with normal issues of procedure and law and process, and this other one about constitutional rights, right? You had this jurisdictional thing, and this is spreading. Now you enter crisis into the matter, right? Now you enter into the norm is not there, and the survival of the state is essential, and that therefore this becomes this adds what he says. It adds this. What is he saying? The extraordinary lawmaker at the same time in this matter, right? And therefore, this which determines determined by but what's supposed to be that the dominant position is supposed to be the legislator, right? But the Weimar Constitution contains still another second uh, uh, rel- relativization and problemization of the ordinary legislature and its system of legality. So, in other words, okay, first you have these three problems, but then the Weimar Constitution adds another one, adds another relativization and problemization of this ordinary legislature in its system of legality. The Constitution introduces a legislative process in the form of direct plebiscitary democracy. Uh-oh. So this is a warning. I was that all of a sudden the Constitution, it brings in this concept of the plebiscite, right? The plebiscites, referendum, right? He says introduces the Constitution introduces a legislative process in terms of direct plebiscite democracy. There are the four cases of referendum: Article 73 1, 73 2, 74 3, and 76 2. These are four cases built into the parliamentary legislative process, in which the people voting directly on the question appears as last conflict resolution organ at the conclusion of parliamentary legislative process. In other words, it seems to me that he's saying that this is introduced as kind of a conflict resolution, that the parliament is divided and they don't know what to do, so they give it to the people to decide, right? Referendum, or do a plebiscitary referendum, right? In addition, in other words, in addition, an autonomous, directly democratic, popular legislative procedure is introduced through Article 73, Section 3, which runs parallel to and competitively with the ordinary parliamentary legislative process, in which a statute comes through a referendum. A statute comes about through a referendum in response to initiative. So, initiative concept, right? That the people through a referendum create a statute. Okay. The substantive guarantees of the second part of the Weimar Constitution constitute an extraordinary superior league lawmaker next to an ordinary subordinate one, more specifically for the protection of certain objects and interests on the basis of their content, hence the material reason, right? The material rational material in the referendum. In the referendum, by contrast, the people appear as the extraordinary lawmaker in opposition to, and certainly also superior to, the parliament. So this is what he says. Now, in the referendum and in initiative, they are an alternative. The people become an alternative lawmaker, extraordinary lawmaker. The people appear as an extraordinary law in opposition to and superior to the parliament. And their extraordinariness, as well as their superior status, produces the rational suprematus from their characteristic as sovereign. So therefore, they're the sovereign. You're pointing to the sovereign. In other words, the people. This is popular. Remember, the legislative model, legislative state, assumes that the people are the sovereign. It emerges out of the concept of popular sovereignty. The people collectively are the sovereign, and they decide that they're going to operationalize the sovereign through its government through this parliamentary body. Okay, and therefore they elect representatives, and they're going to do this representative model. By going directly to the people, they are going directly to the sovereign, and therefore this is why it says the superior status produces a rational. Okay, yeah, highest, the supreme, the ultimate, right? This is the supreme reason, the suprematous reason, the reason that is the ultimate, the highest, and sovereign in that sense, right? It is the most suprematus, means the supreme rationale. That is the highest one, and like this. I'm sorry, I did not mean extraordinary. Yes, extraordinary is that the occurrence of the supreme thing is extraordinary in this moment because it is higher. This is how Schmitt labels it, but I think suprematus means supreme, right? That's I decided to go just quickly look at that to make sure my doubt was going on because Schmitt is doing it. Why is Schmitt always referring to this as extraordinary, and then then all of a sudden I realize, oh no, he's doing it because you only go to the sovereign in extraordinary circumstances, right? So it produces, in other words, the extraordinariness as well as their superior status produces this supreme reasoning, ration suprematus, from their characteristic sovereign. Even in a logically consistent essay, Erwin Jacobin, that shows that in a democratic state form, the expression of the people's will through a direct vote is superior to even indirect forms of expression. Thus, even parliamentary decisions and a statute that consequently come through a referendum cannot be eliminated or amended through the passage of a statute of the Reichstag. So he's saying that all of a sudden this idea that this, I mean, this is the problem. This is the in constitutionality. This is a problem. This is why the founding fathers, really American founding fathers, did not really like the idea of referenda, because they thought this was kind of dangerous or unstabilizing, because this is an appeal that the only real referendum is the Constitution. That the appeal to the people through the creation of the Constitution, and if you create amendments, it has to be a process by which the amendments are done to not always just simply appeal to the people. It was not simply do referendum. It was going to be through a representative process, a process of representation and not direct appeal. This is because this was kind of like, it was too, because there was not a homogenous people, and that therefore there would be kind of a situation where if you did things by referendum, you could get majority. You can get the founders always feared majority tyranny, or a situation where you cannot get anything done and nothing gets ever worked upon, right? So he's saying that this process, that Jacobi is saying that, I'm sorry, the referendum that's been done, this thing, it's constitutional. Its status is that it's like the Constitution. The Constitution itself is from the people. So therefore, something that comes directly from the sovereign is higher than something that comes out of a representative entity created by the sovereign, the legislature. So this is why he says that thus even parliamentary, in other words, it cannot be, in other words, a direct vote is superior to indirect form, and even parliamentary decisions in a statute consequently comes through a referendum cannot be eliminated or amended through the passage of a statute. In other words, again, this is U.S. law. That same thing. This is what a mere something in the Constitution cannot be overturned by a statute. So therefore, something a dictate, and this is the big problem. This becomes a big problem in American law in the 1980s, 1990s, when people start in California and states start using referendums to pass certain things. But then what happens is the courts, both state courts and federal courts, or state courts, appealing to federal 14th Amendment criteria, start overturning these people referendums. This is the famous Colorado, I think it was something with gay rights, and the famous Colorado case. And later, I think it was Romer. I think that's what I forget the name of the case. This happened in mid 96, 97, 96 and that stuff, and that a referendum was done there to restrict certain rights of homosexuals, and a popular and many of these referendums passed, but then the courts nullified them by using the 14th Amendment equal protection provisions as saying that these, therefore, the higher sovereignty of the Union against the sovereignty of the states and the people of the states. And because there was never this is some people argument. This is the problem here, right? This is why you can see popular governments. Popularism prefers referendum. This is why it's very oddly the progressive elites. This is because the populists, and this is in the turn of the 19th century, the populists and the progressives were allied against the embodied interests. Okay, the 1880s, 1890s, 19-teens, 1900s, against the embedded economic interests of oligarchic power, And that oligarchic power is much more limited. It's mostly the political power of state legislatures and particularly the state assemblies, and the power that they had in shaping the Senate, right? Constantly blocking reform, right? Okay, that's why am I doing? I'm going away from Schmitt, but this is Schmitt is talking about the particular case in German. I'm trying to give you a reference to understand what Schmitt is doing here, right? That the full consistent terms of the principle of democratic state form. At this point, it can remain undiscussed whether the will expressed in the general popular vote itself is in every case already the sovereign, specifically the direct sovereign, or whether this will stands only, as Jacobi said, in the general vicinity of sovereignty. So Jacobi argues that that the election votes are kind of not really they're kind of only it's not, it wasn't simply, the question is the people in their election results in election results the sovereign will, or is it kind of close to it? In other words, as he says, that the language that Jacobi uses is in the general vicinity of sovereignty. Not specifically sovereignty. So this is where I think Jacobi would kind of disagree with someone like Rand, the famous Racine, sorry, I think Racine, who argued in his essay about this, that public opinion is sovereignty. We understand the sovereign through popular opinion. Okay, that the sovereignty is made every day through popular opinion, right? But this is the case of the idea here is that, okay, no, that this is if it's not sovereignty itself, it's close enough, right? Next to the instance of the extraordinary plebiscitary decision, the Weimar Constitution preserves the overall organization of the parliamentary legislative state, whose system of legality has a different internal logic than plebiscitary democracy. So therefore the Constitution, see, this is the contradiction, that it establishes a plebiscitary system of doing this, but it still maintains the form, preserves the overall organization of a parliamentary legislative state, whose system of legality of that system has a completely different internal logic than plebiscitary democracy. In its second principal part, the Weimar Constitution contains not only a second constitution standing in opposition to the first principal part, but inside the first principal part concerning the organization of legislative state, two differing systems of parliamentary legality and plebiscite legitimacy stand side by side. So therefore, wait a minute. So this is you have a divide here, but then in the first part, these things seem to be against each other, the first and second part, right? And then the first part has two, a normal legislative process and a plebiscitary process, right? On these grounds, there are no compelling reasons to grant higher legal status to law resulting from a referendum than to statute stemming from an act of parliament. Okay, right? So therefore, on these grounds, there was these two parallel tracks, that it's no longer, there was something coming from the plebiscite and it's not this, the law trumps the plebiscite. Okay, they're equal in that sense, right? And in my opinion, this result would only be certain and beyond question if the Constitution had put plebiscitary system of direct democracy unequivocally in place of the parliamentary legislative state and its system of legality. So it would have been better if the Constitution was clear about this. See, the structure and logic and actually the interpretation of this is a legislative state, not a plebiscitary state. But by doing this, it creates that problem, which is this. Okay, but it's not clear. The Constitution does not become clear about this, right? The Constitution undoubtedly did not intend this, right? It says this is a bad intention, right? This didn't intend. So people didn't think this through. That's what Schmitt is kind of saying, right? While the Constitution only organized a constitutional democracy, right, it sought to remain true to the idea of parliamentary legislative state, which was valid simply on the basis of a 100-year tradition as the constitutional state, the Reichstag, right? Reichstag, right? This is constitutional state, Reichstag. Reichstag. This is why I don't really like that he translates. Doesn't always the translator here. I'm not sure it's McCormick, but whoever's translating is not always consistently translating. Sometimes you leave the German word or Latin word, and there's not, I'm not able to go to the note. On this system, I can't easily go to the notes back and forth and I don't want to get lost like one time I did and had to unrecord everything or stop recording, throw it away. So let's look at this, right? So therefore, you have this. They didn't get clear. They didn't intend this mess to be the mess, and they wanted to keep the parliamentary tradition because this was a 100-year tradition. This Reichstag. They wanted something familiar. In other words, the Weimar Constitution people didn't want something wholly radically new, because that would, maybe unstable things and people might not have been accepted it. They needed to maintain this, the whole intellectual tradition of the Reichstag tradition was just there, and they just needed to do it and just take the Kaiser out of the picture, right? And to kind of take the Kaiser out of the picture and remove the governmental aspect of it, just make it more logistically consistent, right? On the other hand, the Constitution certainly accorded lawmaker status to the people deciding in plebiscitary directness. However, the regulation remains stuck in a contradictory ambiguity and incompleteness, not only because a parliamentary decision is integrated even into the people's actual legislative procedure of Article 73-3, through which, again, Parliament regains possibility of channeling the plebiscite lawmaking procedure into a parliamentary process. In other words, this process is this later Article 3, Article 73-3 gives the procedure by which the Parliament retains the possibility of forcing this to go through the plebiscite lawmaking procedure through a parliamentary process. But above all, because the different referenda, all designated by the same term, differ from one another according to the legislative procedure in which they appear. So in other words, remember there was 4 types of these kind of referenda, but the 4 types had to go through different procedures, right? And sometimes it says, and therefore, here's what his point is, that above all, because the different referenda, all designated the same term, differ from one another according to the legislative procedure in which they appear. In one instant, a referendum folds itself into a parliamentary legislative state system of legality. In another, it has a distinctive, specific value of a plebiscite expression of the people's will. So one case, this kind of referendum it kind of folds itself into the legislative system. And this one kind of sees itself as a direct representation of the people's will, right? Sovereign will, right? Of the people's will. The 4 cases of referendum that decide conflicts, in which the referendum appears as the conclusion of the parliamentary lawmaking procedure, Article 73-1, 73-2, 74-3, 76-2, are incorporated into this process. Here, the directly voting people are put to use as an organ of parliamentary lawmaking procedure. And it was already said above that diverse organs, government, first and second chamber, king and others can participate in the legislative process without the foundations of the parliamentary legislative state being disturbed as a result, right? That's this idea that other diverse organs can participate in the diverse organs, the government, first and second chamber, and the king can participate in the legislative process without the foundations of this parliamentary legislature being disturbed as a result. Even here, given the democratic foundation, it was not the same whether the king or the people opposed the popular assembly. According to a well-known argument, especially Rousseau's version, that the representative must fall silent when the represented themselves speak. The democratic consequence is that the popular assembly must always recede into the background if opposed by the people. It represents. So therefore, in other words, if the representatives speak, the representative must be silent, right? This is that famous line. This is from Rousseau, right? The representative must fall silent when the people themselves speak. That's a very interesting argument, Rousseau, in that sense. And this is one of the reasons why I would like to. I think I'm going to read Rousseau next for you guys after I finish Schmitt or Montesquieu. But that is an argument of the direct plebiscitary non-representative democracy. So the different type of form is it is no longer once you say that, right, this is no longer the representative democracy. This is a plebiscitary or direct democracy, right? Certainly, when the representative of parliament collapses and no longer finds supporters, the plebiscitary process is always stronger. The result, however, differs from the juristic conception that E. Jacobi drew, and remains to be shown below the quality of. In other words, he says that this is the juristic concept that between the two concepts of law and what is done. He's saying that the plebiscite, this a legislative thing, something that comes directly from the people, have more authority than that comes to the representative agent. Okay. So therefore, they're not equal on that ground, and therefore this cannot overturn that. The lower cannot overturn the higher, right? That's what law argues. In fact, that's the famous thing about this. The inferior body cannot, an inferior thing that has lesser jurisdiction cannot overturn a higher organ that has higher authority, has authority over it and higher status over it, right? So it's the higher can overturn the lower, but the lower cannot overturn the higher. And that's a classic juristic. This is a fundamental principle of juristic procedure in that sense, or legal procedure, right? In that sense, right? It remained to be shown below that the quality of parliament itself changed through these plebiscitary elements. So therefore, he's saying that, in other words, it's going to how the plebiscite elements change the process of the parliament, right? Parliament is transformed into a mere intermediary phase of the plebiscitary system. So parliament no longer is the real thing; it becomes an intermediate stage. In other words, and then as long as the plebiscite is not needed, when it's needed, then it's the intermediate stage in that sense. What he's saying. But the constitutionally provided legislative process and the system of legality that rests on it are not directly changed. So even though it says that the parliament is transformed by this process of this thing, it changes that it becomes no longer. In other words, that the parliament is transformed into a mere intermediate phase of the plebiscite system. But what he says, the constitution provided legislative process and the legality that rests on that process are not changed. On the contrary, one can firmly believe that the plebiscitary decision is a statutory conclusion. In other words, the law that these people, in other words, the plebiscite is a statutory conclusion in the sense of the system of legality. So the system of legality, resting on this kind of system of legislative process, understands the referendum, the plebiscitary decision, as a statutory conclusion. Obviously, then, the plebiscite decision stands alongside Parliament's statutory one as of equal, not superior value. So therefore, this is that their equal value in light of the judicial thinking, the legal juristic legality of how the lawyers are going to understand this. They're looking at this and they're arguing this in terms of the legislative system. They understand the state system. They're understanding in other words, the way the law and the lawmakers and the lawyers and the judges understand this is still through the lens of the parliamentary state, and therefore understand this referendum not as something higher than the act of the legislature, but as on equal grounds of it, and therefore just a mere, as he says, statutory decision, right? Statutory conclusion. On equal par with the legislature, right? This is what he's trying to say here. In other words, it is clear that the text of the written constitution that there is a great difference between the referendum of a parliamentary legislative state and the one response to the initiative under the popular legislative procedure. In the first case, the system of the parliamentary legislative state is not modified. A different type of legislature is not established through the organization of the new variety of legislative process to the lawmaker. With the popular legislative procedure under Article 73-3, by contrast, just a new legislative process was introduced. Okay, so that one form of this Article 73-3 method of referendum only creates a new legislative process, right? That's introduced, right? One type of referendum belongs to the system of a parliamentary legislative state. One type of referendum belongs to a type of parliamentary legislative state, whereas the other, the people emerge as the exclusive final figure of a democratic plebiscitary system. So another one that in one type of referendum, it is merely a process, right? But in the other one, it's the people are the ultimate. The people are emerged as the exclusive, decisive figure of this system. In fact, the latter, has plebiscitary legitimacy instead of legality of the legislative state. So therefore, legitimacy. In other words, the latter has plebiscitary legitimacy instead of legality of the legislative state. So this is what this legality. See, this is why the term legality and legitimacy, right? This distinction between these two fundamental concepts. The legality is the lawmaking, the law, and the way the law is understood by the system, the regime. Okay, and therefore the law understood by the parliamentary understands its law and its procedure and its process will be defined by the kind of regime or the type, state type you have. And the different state types produce different things. Now, this Weimar Constitution introduces a plebiscitary democracy. In other words, there's a distinction between a plebiscitary democracy, Schmitt says, and its legality, and the one of a parliamentary state, a parliamentary legislative state. So there's a problem here, right? The latter, in fact, the plebiscitary legitimacy instead of the legality of the legislative state. These referenda are expressions of two entirely different state types. In other words, these different things. That one type of referendum is going to be the legislative state type that conforms and operates under the legislative state type that understands it legislatively and parliamentary. And the other one is, no, it's a different state type, right? Just as one rightly puts the institutions of direct democracy as an unavoidable consequence of democratic thinking in a position superior to the so-called indirect democracy of the parliamentary state, so on the other hand, the parliamentary legislative state system of legality remains a remarkable formulation, both conceptually and organizationally, which is in no way derived from from democracy and the will of the people at a given time. Right. So therefore, okay, this is an important sentence in this thing, because what is he saying here? He says that this is okay. You have this referendum, but then you have this idea that the legal mind, the legal. In other words, he's saying what? In other words, I mean, even John rightly puts these intuition democracy into a democratic position, right? That they're right about this. Just as one rightly puts these institutions of direct democracy referendum as unavoidable consequences in a superior position to so-called indirect democracy, right? So on the other, so while that is true at one level, but then on the other, he says parliamentary, let's say, system of legality remains the remarkable formulation, both conceptually and organizationally, which in no way derive from democratic democracy and the will of the people at any given time. So this legislative entity is pre-democratic in that sense, he's saying. The legislative state culminating in the establishment of norms appears essentially and appropriately purer in the guise of the parliamentary legislative state than in the forms of direct democracy, which gives expression to the voluntas, the will, or not reason. In other words, will, not reason, voluntas, not ratio, demanding legitimacy, not legality. Again, this is that famous point in Schmitt that he's saying that the parliamentary model, the legislative model, and the idea of rule of law idea prefers that law, reason, ratio, decides things rather than will, right? Therefore, this is why this. In fact, that is kind of what the argument of Federalist Papers really are. You know, go to American Federalist Papers and the idea of division of power. That the process designed to ensure that the momentary will of a people wouldn't derail things. Because the idea that the will can be arbitrary and divisive. In fact, this is the criticism of Plato, right? Famous Plato's criticism. Against democracy, that democracy is the will of the people doing, and the will of the people is contradictory, and therefore that's bad government, right? So therefore, the idea of that reason should govern the will, or so give expression to voluntas, not rational, to make legitimacy, not legality. Therefore, this is the idea of the direct democracy. To the same degree, the logical consistency of a system built on the idea of representation is different than that of the plebiscite democratic sovereign people, which is directly presented and thus not represented. So therefore, this is, in other words, it's not represented; it directly stands. He's basically explained the difference between a parliamentary system, which is a representational system, and a direct system. There's no need for representation in a direct system because that is simply there; it's direct, right? If the statute in the parliamentary legislative process state foregoes any quality of the law and yet is still understood only as the momentary decision of the present parliamentary majority, and if in the democratic state the current will of the present popular majority decides with the Constitution incorporating both the parliamentary and popular majorities, then two not necessary congruent types of transitoriness stands independent alongside one another. So not, in other words, it has two not necessary congruent types. So therefore, the idea of a popular majority and the parliamentary majority. I mean, and I can see this as the famous line from Kendall of the two majorities, right? I think this is a very good idea. I think you understand that once you understand that there's once you have in other words, presidential majority. Kendall was talking about the difference between the majority that creates a president versus the majority that creates the Congress, and therefore that's how we understood this as two different types of process that creates two different majorities. But Schmitt is not talking about like that. He's talking about something about that. Okay, no, these two types of systems, the parliament. In other words, this process that this logic creates two majorities. Creates a majority based on that elects a parliament and the people, the popular majorities. And the system assumes that these two things are congruent when they're not necessarily congruent, right? Independently along one another, two types, not necessarily congruent types, stand independently alongside one another, right there. From the standpoint of functional thinking, that leads to the recognition of momentary presence. The logically consistent result seems to lie with the popular vote, right? So therefore, from the formalistic thinking, the popular vote understands that this seems to be the way that you moment this, right? For the parliament is elected for 4 years, or as noted, not from moment to moment. And as a result, its transitory character is constantly present. It's consistently presented in the context of a wide ranging suppression of the transitory, namely in course of the multi-year election period. So therefore, this is the famous problem, right? That the popular thing, the wheels constantly change. So therefore, at the time of the election, the a popular majority creates the parliamentary body. But then what happens is this parliamentary body that becomes parliamentary is there for 4 years, and that 4 years may be a distinction between what the populace. There might be a gap of separation between this, that the parliamentary majority and the popular, whatever it is, the majority of the time at the moment, right? This is that because of the multi-year election period. According even to the logical consistency of functional thinking, would arrive at the result put forth by Erwin Jacobi, that the referendum is always a higher form of decision. Okay, so therefore, this idea that the election process, because of that gap of that, therefore this situation, therefore referendum is higher. It's like the election in that sense. The election is the referenda is higher than the legislative because it is representing the will at the people's will at that time and at that moment, right? Nevertheless, the current result of the temporary popular vote is present and momentary in a higher degree than the current will of a more established assembly that is constituted for a longer duration. So therefore, this idea that nevertheless, the current result of a temporary popular vote is present and momentary in a higher degree than the current will of a more established assembly that is constituted for a longer duration, right? These two things that I said. While the extraordinary lawmaker of the Weimar Constitution's second principal part, introduced by the rationale material, specifically limits on constitutional grounds the functionalism of the transitory parliamentary majority of the parliamentary legislative state. The majoritarian functionalism is further increased and driven to the logical extreme through the simultaneous introduction of a second, once again differently constituted extraordinary lawmaker, specifically the people deciding through plebiscites. So therefore, this idea that in other words, the second principal part introduces limits to what the legislative can do and how it can alter it. If this wants to alter these, it has to do it by this higher threshold, not by simple majority. Now the question is further increased and driven to logical extreme through the simultaneous introduction of a second, again differently constituted extraordinary lawmaker, specifically the people deciding through representative. Rationally considered, is quite clear that there is contradictions here. So therefore, the people acting like this is, this is a contradiction. There's fundamental contradictions in what's going on, he says. The contradiction becomes especially evident in the fact that the double-sided manner of calculating the voting resulting the majority numbers proceed parallel to one another without any relation between them. Okay, so therefore the contradiction is that these two different the way you're doing it is completely different. For a statute amending the Constitution, one needs a 2/3 rather than a simple parliamentary majority, right? Okay, so I need a 2/3. For a statute amending the Constitution, I need a 2/3 rather than a simple majority. One does not dare demand the same sort of qualified majority of the directly presented people during a referendum. The contradiction with the democratic principle of the simple majority here would be all too striking. In this way, Article 76 is satisfied, for it demands only the consistent of a simple majority of those entitled to vote in a referendum in response to a people's initiative to amend the Constitution. By contrast, for a referendum proposing a set aside to set aside a discussion of the Reichstag. Article 75 requires the participation majority of those entitled to vote in the referendum. Thus, a mere quorum or a minimum number needed to reach such a decision. Despite the jurisdictional legitimization through the Electoral Review Commission of the Reichstag, the current practice of Article 75 refers this determination, in my opinion, incorrectly, to a referendum in response to an initiative. Right? So it has to do with the initiative. Today, consequently, it is the case that the participants in a referendum are only those who vote yes. And today, consequently, it is the case that in other words, this is how they understand it. You need a 75% yes. That in other words, not 75% of if you have a quorum of the population. No, it's not. It's only in other words today. Consequently, it is, and this is the ruling of this commission. He thinks is incorrect. In the case that the participants in the referendum are only those who vote yes. If that is the majority of those entitled to vote, then a referendum with yes occurs, which always simultaneously satisfies the requirement of the referendum amending the Constitution under Article 76. Whoever is successful generated in bringing about a referendum readily and ipso readily and by fact, right, has also brought about a referendum amending the Constitution, right? So therefore, if you bring a referendum, you also bring a referendum to the Constitution. At one point of if one point of departure is that the people are entirely and fully represented in Parliament according to the theoretical foundations of a representative system, and moreover that the Constitution attempts to orchestrate the more exact possible arithmetic congruence between the people's majority and the parliamentary majority, then one must ask why the consent of two-thirds majority is required for a constitutional amendment in Parliament, while a simple majority is sufficient for a referendum through initiative for the same purpose. In other words, it's pointing out the contradiction. That if the parliamentary thing has to be, like this, well, why is it two-thirds here but normal majority here? Okay. We couldn't get away with it. It would be clearly undemocratic in the other case. And so you have this contradiction in the system, right? Right. The logic of the voting calculus is often particular, but anchored implicitly, here is a remarkable no confidence declaration against the parliamentary legislature state. So therefore, this is that inside of here is that the calculus in this creates a no confidence that we can't trust. In other words, he's saying that the fact that the referendum only needs a majority of the voters, were people who are registered to vote, right? If 51 of the if 50 plus one of all registered voters vote for say yes on this, then it is changed. Where the parliamentarians requires two-thirds. So therefore, we don't trust Parliament. People we trust, the Parliament we don't trust. That's what he's saying. This is a no confidence vote, right? Against the Parliament. Whoever trusts the parliamentary legislature because he considers Parliament an elite, or because he believes in the discussion and openness character of the parliamentary legislative process, must find the Parliament must find in Parliament the stronger guarantees of reasonableness and justice. So in other words, it's going to be that wait a minute. If I believe, in other words, that the parliaments are elite. This is the argument of Madison. Right? We elect the better people. We elect better people. This is actually the Burkean argument in Bristol. Right? We don't elect them to be a mere representative vote. We elect them for their judgment and character. They're elite, and we want them their better judgment and their assessment. This again has the argument of the Federalist Papers in that sense. That therefore they're a guarantee. It's famous the idea that the legislative body is the guarantee against the majority. Right. and therefore they're the stronger. In other words, would find that it is the parliamentary entity is a stronger guarantee of reasonableness and justice. Nevertheless, one provides threshold requirements and limitations for parliament, though not for the direct representation of the people's will itself, about which one has known since ancient times that the people cannot discuss and deliberate. So everybody's, my God, anyone who wants to say that Schmitt, I think the tone of what Schmitt is arguing here, it's he's arguing, saying, listen, direct democracy, this idea that Schmitt is in favor of direct, no. He's saying that from there's a whole tradition that the people cannot. In fact, this is the famous even Aristotle. Plato would argue that, but even Aristotle argues that it's best through law. That the people's, if they're not too slavish, they're good, but if they be not slavish, and therefore law, the regulation of law and law makes them not slavish, right? That's Aristotle's according book 3, why he argues that the people are better judges. But that's the only criteria. They're better judges because they're not slavish. Plato says no, the people are going to be slavish, and therefore they're not going to be good judges, right? Most of the Aristotle is kind of like they can be, yes, generally when they're if they're given to their passions and their things and they're slavish like slaves, then they're going to be bad. But when they're not and they're moderated by law and moderation and institutions, they collectively have better decidings as either one or many. That's book 3, right? Plato doesn't even go that way. Plato's Aristotle, nah. And most of the ancient tradition argues against democracy, right? That's the whole point. What he's saying. He's saying that, in other words, that they cannot discuss and deliberate. In fact, that's the whole other problem. He's right about this. This is something that even Pareto and the whole Italian school points out, that there's how can you participate and deliberate when you have millions of people? It's not possible. You don't have participation and deliberation. In other words, you have a size problem. Deliberation can only be effective in smaller bodies. If the body deliberating becomes too big, then there's no possibility. Deliberation breaks down. The problem. This is the participatory problem in this is the problem of participation, right? Excessive participation and deliberation breaks down. Therefore, you need, in order to avoid that, the ancients. This is why the system of representation was created, to create small bodies that can deliberate. In other words, this is the whole process of why deliberation of bodies were created. And the earliest cities were possible when they were small to have the population do this. But once they got so big and large, the deliberative process broke down. That's the criticism of the ancients in that sense, right? The criticism is not so much that the people themselves were incapable, but that I think it's the size argument, that once you got the larger societies and larger communities, which all of a sudden had the vulgar types outnumbering the people, the vulgar Bassoid outnumbering even the farmers, then these people lack the moderation of the farming element. This created a problem. So therefore, there is an argument for that the Platonic argument is not against the people per se; it is against the mass in that sense. This is this idea of the mass of the people. That is no longer a people moderated by land and size, but it's so big and so large that it becomes unable to discuss and deliberate. So, I mean, I think that's, we have to understand this criticism here, not as simply anti-democratic, but a problem of size, right, and deliberation, right? If you believe that it's will, in other words, this is the question: should deliberation decide? The classics argued that for the purposes, it should be that the way we legislate and law and decide should be based upon reason, deliberation, right, discussion. The moderns, some of them will argue, no, it's will. And once you have will, that's a different process. How we do it. It's simply a mechanism of just simply voting, voting, and no discussion. This is voting, right? Opinion polls. Like this is. So let's continue. Where I'm going over here, so I'm sorry. Of the legislative assembly, whose entire purpose of legislature rests on the reason and moderation that is assumed to reside in it. One demands a two-thirds majority decision. In regard to the people, which bursts into the scene in its complete, though incommunicative, indirect, and emotionally, one is satisfied with a simple majority. Now, this is hilarious. This is a fundamental argument, and I think this is a very interesting, powerful. He's saying that, listen, this is, if you believe in the reason, you should not allow the people to simply have a simple majority. You should give them you should have them have you handicap parliament, legislative things that there are, but you don't handicap the people who you'd have less respect for. Okay, this doesn't make sense, right? And in other words, um, although the communicative direct command one is satisfied with a simple majority, as plausible as the arithmetic and technical considerations for the most part are, as long as one utilizes them in abstract purity without an object. Majority calculus of the Constitution and its technology of political will formulation also becomes confusing and contradictory once one considers them in the concrete connection of a system of legality. So he's saying that, okay, let's look at this instead of in terms of what is the object, okay, but in terms of the purity of the system. Let's look at this as a system. What you've done here. Oh my God, it's a mess. One considers them in concrete connection to the system of legality. So remember, you have the political constitutional process and this process, this process, and then you have the legal frame that comes out of this process that then interprets these things. And now, first, it does two things. One, it interprets them, it clarifies them, it then enacts them. Right? That's the problem here, right? In this regard, therefore, the Weimar Constitution also contains two different types of logical consistency. From public or democratic considerations, the Weimar Constitution has situated the people in the popular legislative, popular democratic legislative process as the extraordinary legislature next to the parliament as the ordinary legislature, and has added some plebiscite democratic legitimacy to the system of the legislative state, which is founded entirely on the basis of legality. So, in other words, the democratic legislative state, the legislative state, the parliamentary legislature, which is founds itself on legality, on the legal, on law, on legality. This is the argument that it rests itself. Now, what happens is by adding the argument was that this system was basically the parliamentary legislative state rests wholly more on legality. In that sense, this logic in a system is process, and in the way the legal system understood this. But what they did is they brought in parliamentary, plebiscitary aspects to give democratic legitimacy towards it. Right? They added some of this to the system of legislative state, right? In view of the unsystematic incompleteness with which that occurred, one cannot discern with rational arguments of legal scholarship which of the two systems is the superior one. So they're given what happened, the process, which one is the superior one? This legality-based system of legislative parliamentary, or this plebiscitary system that emphasizes legitimacy. That's why title like and this we and from a strictly a view of a view of this thing, a rational arguments of legal scholarship cannot which is superior. The question is, can two different legal systems exist side by side, right? In any case, one will not be able to say that through a haphazard intervention that explodes in constitutional systematic framework, not only of the fifth section federal lawmaking, but also that of Article 73 itself, due to the inclusion of paragraph 3 with its disintegrative effects. The Weimar Constitution intends to eliminate intentionality and according to a systemic plan. The parliamentary legislative system proclaimed with such emphasis and decisiveness in Article 68. So, in other words, that Article 68 says that the parliamentary legislative thing is like this. In other words, he says this big paragraph here. This is in any case, it will not be able to stand to the haphazard intervention of these claims that are made. This is not only in Articles federal lawmaking, which is Article 73, due to the inclusion of paragraph 3, right, of the Weimar Constitution intended to eliminate intentionality and according to a systematic plan, right? This legislative system proclaimed with such emphasis and distinction in Article 69. On the other hand, the plebiscite democratic system of legitimacy inexorably develops its own inner logic. So therefore, yes, there's this whole argument defending the parliamentary legislative framework of legality. Okay? But the problem is the plebiscite system creates its own logic, right? It will show below with the practical effects which result from this unsystematic pairing of parliamentary and plebiscite lawmaker. From the written constitution itself, one can only theoretically glean the image that Walter Jellinek, 1927, presented very graphically when speaking of a race between sovereigns, a race between sovereigns. So Walter Jellinek, I think, is a son or descendant of the other famous, the famous Jellinek, who is the constitutional scholar of law, that was one of the famous legal scholars of Germany, right? I think that's the case. I don't think it's the same Jellinek, but I think it's his son or his cousin or something. Hold on. Yeah, it's not his son. His son, Gregor. It's Georg Velnik, is the great Stadler, constitutional theory student of constitutional law, constitutional theory, German. This is his son. Present, this idea, this race between both sovereigns. He adds that in this race, the Reichstag will always win, although it is doubtful that the Reichstag could dare to take up battle with the people. In other words, they would always win, but that the Reichstag would dare take up battle with people. In this formulation, measured with the model objectivity, the question at issue found an unpossessing, though nevertheless apt expression. When it is merely a matter of a single race, one may not only ask who has the best prospects of overtaking the other. In other words, if it's only one race, right? It's not. In other words, in this formulation, measured with the model of objectivity, the question at issue found an unpossessing, though nevertheless apt expression, right? That it will be race between these two, right? And that, of course, that the Reichstag will always win, but they won't ever go against the people who will, right? And this is. But then he says, when it matter of a simple single race, one may not only ask who has the best perspectives of overtaking the other, right? Has the best prospect. One may not only ask who has this best question. Instead, one must also keep in mind a thoroughly momentous consequence for the legal system of the Constitution itself. So what happens if it does? In other words, what happens when this happens and the people's faith in the Reichstag destroys itself, right? And therefore, boom, for the system itself, right? Therefore, this question, it's not going to do it, but we'll never do it. But what happens if it does? And the issue becomes that the people want what the Reichstag won't. No, I'm sorry, it's stronger, it's able to prevent it, and therefore, this has enormous consequence for the legal system of the Constitution itself. For the duality of both types of legislation and legislature is a duality of two divergent systems of justification. So these systems, these two types of legislation and legislature, that's through parliamentary model, one through the plebiscite, creates what? Two divergent systems of justification. the system of legality of the parliamentary legislative state and that of the participatory democratic legitimacy. In both types of races, in both types of races, there is not only a competition of organs, but also a struggle between two forms of law. So there's not only a struggle between organs, people and the thing, but also struggle of two forms of law. In this struggle, at the very such race, the current possessor of momentary power, the present parliamentary majority, had a great head start. Yet, as will be shown, that is not decisive for the final result and does not restore the pure parliamentary legislature. In other words, it's not going to restore it. Yes, the current majority has hold a lot of power, a lot of movement, like this, but it's not going to restore the system. Okay, and this is how he ends the chapter. Okay, we're going to end here. Okay, it's been long. I understand. Well, next time you see me, we'll be doing chapter 5, the last chapter, but not the conclusion of this thing. If you have any comments or questions, please put them below, and when I see them, I will respond to them. Again, I hope people will watch it. I think this is, yes, it's technical, and it's going to say, oh my God, Schmitt is boring. Technical. He's a lawyer. This is the thing about Schmitt. This is his brilliance as a lawyer. This is, and you see that you can in this Schmitt, you get a different Schmitt than you can say that is often presented. Oh yeah, he's a fan of the Nazis. No, he's saying he's showing the dangers of why the Nazis emerged. Now Schmitt will say opportunistically side with Nazis, but that's a different question. Why he does this? I think he does it because they're the winners, and they're in charge, and they're going to define, and they're the ones who are in command, and they're going to define. They have effectively gathered control. They have somehow gathered the people's will, and are effectively utilizing it in a way that now is created. That's the Schmitt warning of this, and that's why this is the danger. He's saying that the legislative state is dead forever, and it's going to be some kind of publicitory system, which will not be a legislative state. It's going to be a hybrid governmental / administrative state. Okay, in that sense. Okay. So again, any questions, comments, please put them below. Like it if you like it. Share it with your friends. Hit the like button. Share it with friends. Share your allies and people you know you might like this. Put in your social media, your Twitter, your whatever social media you use to kind of remind people to go check us out, and check this whole series out of this Schmitt and the other Schmitt and those other things they might be interested in. So if you're not subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. Encourage others to subscribe. Another thing I would ask you to do is to well, if you didn't like it, you have criticisms and things. You can, of course, hit the down like button. But please don't tell me. Please say in the comments what criticisms, and maybe I can learn from it. I make anything. Everyone can make mistakes. Even I can make mistakes. Sometimes my Latin is horrible, and I kind of freak out on it. My Latin is weak. I don't use it as much as I should. My Greek is better, but even then, it's kind of like I still have to go to the dictionary. Okay, a lot of times. So, and some of my German is weak too, but I can play with it a little bit. So therefore, of course, please put your comments in there and I will respond to them in that sense. Another thing is you want to follow me on social media, links are below. You can find also my academic links are below. Another thing you can do if you want to help do what I do, want to help me financially or substantively in a sense, you can do so by joining subscribes to our Patreon. I said, no one's doing it because you're doing it for free, Batesy boy. Why should I give you money? By the way, I understand it's a reality that if you're not very big patrons, and it's going to be 1% of that, and I only have like this. I'm below even that. It's like less than 1%. I think the reality is 0.3%, or maybe even 0.01% of people actually. It's between 0.3 to 0.101 of people, or less, in fact. But I'm not 10,000. I'm not a huge number of people. I understand that. If you want to help, you can do so either by you can Patreon, like I said, Stripe Star. To those who don't like Patreon, but then also you can do so. Send me money by Google Mail or whatever mechanism you can do. You got my email. My email. I should put the email on there, but you can find my email, and you can only send something through that. I can get it that way. Okay, whatever. Um, Another way you can do it is by buying my books. The books are there. Of course, the Lulu book on Aristotle is, but the other books also. Please buy them. That's why you can help me. I don't necessarily get royalty checks by the Boston University book, but the LSU book I do. So you can want to do that. You buy a book. You can do Amazon or directly by any means. Um, Another thing you can. That's it. That's about the rocks. Again, these are the Schmitt things are Tuesdays, Thursdays. We're finishing yesterday when you saw that you suffered the 4 hour Montesquieu. I apologize for book 28. Okay, that's book 28 was the monster book of the Spirit of Law. So I understand. So you'll be looking at the short one hopefully on Wednesday, and Fridays are either a live stream or messing around. So again, that's it. We'll take care and have a good day. Thank you for being here, and see you again next time soon, sometime soon. Bye bye.